Bleh. I always try to do Henry Rollins' impression of Iggy, but I can never sustain it. I'm going to try for like 2 seconds and then I'll stop.
All right.
I was wait. I was laying on my back on the floor. I can't do it. I can't say I I was laying on my back on the floor of the Stooges rehearsal room, stoked on LSD and reefer, staring at the lovely amplifier. I can't do it. I'm just going to read it normally. Staring at the lovely amplifiers and egg cartons on the walls when I thought I saw the word Funhouse hovering above me in the air, just below the ceiling. We were about halfway through the writing and preparation for our sophomore album, and it needed a title this time. I remember thinking, this is it. We're going with it. The rehearsal room was set up in the former salon of a lovely old farmhouse we rented for $325 a month on the outskirts of Ann Arbor. It had a wide porch, a stately driveway, and a nice lawn and trees. There was an abandoned cornfield and a junked car in the back. The farmer was too old to live there anymore, so we took it over. There was a kitchen, a rec room, a TV room, rehearsal room, 2 proper bedrooms, 2 separate apartments, and a converted attic and basement. 6 of us slept there most of the time. There was a lot of dope smoking, some good writing, and a bit of rehearsal done at that house, which later became known as the Fun House after the album. So it's interesting. I always thought that it was it was called Fun House because they called the house Fun House, but I guess the house became Fun House afterwards. The songs on the album were all written there, most of it in my attic bedroom. Ron had gotten his hands on the best private apartment and a nice girlfriend too, named Shelley. So he wasn't as prolific as he had been previously, and I don't blame him. Anyway, I'd write a number that I thought that the group could play well, bring it downstairs from my attic room, and try to rehearse it up. Once it was solid, we'd play it at our gigs over on the weekends. Scott Ashton and myself were both very keen to do something much more aggressive than our first record, which was more laid back in certain ways. I'm not sure what Ron ever thought about that, but he definitely enjoyed what we were doing on this new record. As the concept progressed, I felt that the kind of music we were doing needed to expand and explode as the record moved forward. And that's why we brought in Steve McKay, RIP, well, RIP to all of them, to help blow us over the top with his psychedelic sax. The group had 2 vehicles that we depended on. One was a black 57 Chrysler New Yorker with a push-button transmission. John Adams, who lived in the basement. John Adams is the guy who introduced the whole band to heroin, by the way. Yeah. John Adams, who lived in the basement and did a variety of chores, such as driving us around, getting us to gigs, and humping the equipment, was the owner and chauffeur. We also had rented a truck that was driven by Eric Haddix, and I believe that's the truck that infamously went under the freeway that was too low, and they took off the whole top of the truck. That's a funny Stooges story. Who was a very tough boy and all-around cool soul, who for some reason almost always wore black leather gloves. Not a guy you would want to fuck with. So one by one, the tunes were falling into place. TVI was the key number on the record for me. To get that, I had to camp in the hallway outside of Ron's door for over an hour, pounding and pleading with him to let me come in and write a goddamn song. He finally compromised by coming out in the hallway with his Fender Princeton practice amp and his Strat and played me the riff. I thought, oh shit, that's really got it. By the way he was playing it, it was in the style of No Fun or I Want to Be Your Dog from our first, but the way he was playing it in the style of No Fun or I Want to Be Your Dog from our first record sounded too large and thick to allow the song to go anywhere. So I asked him to throw in a variation for my tagline and to begin the number in the style of a John Lee Hooker, in the style of John Lee Hooker, an artist we both liked, playing the single notes against a 1-string drone, blues style, before letting it build up to full sonics. That was right up Ron's alley. He had a beautiful set of fingers and a wonderful touch on his instrument. So many hard rockers are ham-handed, not Ron, yet he managed to be very, very heavy. One key to this, and in a way the key to the whole sonic beauty of the album, was the fact that Ron played with a heavy gauge set of guitar strings. He did this, he told me, because he was originally a bassist, and the heavier string was just more comfortable. And he would later return to that position when the band reformed as Iggy and the Stooges for Raw Power. But it also gave his style a kind of massive ambience. And we began playing this stuff live. It was becoming obvious we had some very strong shit. So springtime rolled around, and this small, very underrated band was flown to Hollywood, somewhere we had never been, to record this very sleek and sexy repertoire in a uniquely beautiful studio. Elektra Studios was a lovely little Spanish colonial Adobe-style structure with a nice little garden area under the California sun, which was great for cigarette breaks. A far cry from the dump over a Times Square peep show where we recorded our first record. There was a modern, mid-sized, tastefully appointed single studio inside where we could fill the room with our intense vibes. This felt like a place where we could really make some fucking art. So we did. The setup was all of us together in the same room, not so far apart, where we could see all of each other and stay in touch. I love how he says that about staying in touch, right? Dave played a half stack and Ron played a Marshall Combo 50 watt. I used a Shure SM57, which remind me, Pete, we got to go back and talk about that, because I think that's the secret weapon for Iggy on that record, the Shure SM57. I'll explain why. I think it's kind of obvious, but I used a Shure SM57 and Electro Voice split signal to the booth, and the other half through an EV speaker from our live setup. All of our equipment made the trip with us, both to keep the sound in our control and because we were booked for shows in LA and San Francisco after the recording. The setup was prone to leakage, but Stooges leakage was not like other people's leakage. The Stooges leaked pearls. Can we pause right there? And I'm going to let Pete jump in there. Pete, can you explain for the audience what Iggy might mean when he talks about leakage and other people's leakage and Stooges leakage?
They basically made a blues record. It was live blues record. Just keep going. And we did that too with our portion of Skull Ring.
Oh, I did not know that.
No, he was in a booth in between the control room and the studio. And half the vocals went through a PV Bandit guitar amp, which actually that came out of a DI box and went into the PV. So it sounded live, and there's a bit of distortion, and that usually will excite a singer.
That's okay. That's really, I did not know that. So it was kind of done. So the Skull Ring stuff was kind of done in the same way that Funhouse was.
Right. Wow. And did one song a day.
Wow. So just same exact system.
Sometimes we wrote it in the studio.
Wow. Okay. Save the Skull Ring talk for the Skull Ring episode, but that's amazing. No, finish what you're going to say. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say, I go back and listen to that, and then I'm like, I could have done that better. But I mean, we did it in 15, 20 minutes.
That's what makes it so good, I think.
Yeah, that's what makes a good rock record.
That's what makes it good. I just love that he uses the word leakage, and I guess is what he's talking? Is he talking about bleed through there essentially?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
vocals and drum mics.
Right.
But
right.
That's what he wanted.
Right. That's what gave it the spirit, the feel, the vibe.
Yeah.
So he said, I love this line. The setup was prone to leakage, but Stooges leakage was not like other people's leakage. Stooges leaked pearls. Yeah, baby. Anyway, after the usual vain attempts to conform us to the studio recording standards were abandoned, we'll talk about that. From the first recording day, the whole thing just took off like a Ferrari. We would devote an entire day to gaining a great recording of each song. In other words, the first day was the day of loose, the next day was down on the street, and so on. We later switched these two numbers in the sequence. Everything else was exactly as we had been playing them live. It was our entire set at the time. About 40 minutes before we were due to start the day's takes, I would drop a tab of acid. I never mentioned this to the fellas, but it was my job in the group to radiate vibes and belief. And that's the way I did it at the time. So as this stuff was coming on, we were jamming. And that was the most authentic experience I've ever had in a recording studio, man. There was not a druggy vibe at all. We would take cigarette breaks, and that was about it. My acid was on the sly. And when we all smoked a ton of weed at the time, we kept it all out of the studio. Everyone was pretty damn impressed to be making a record in a beautiful, slick, pro place right in the middle of Hollywood. And so we were on our best behavior, I would say. As the recording show, I sang live and in full, take after take. There was a very, very little vocal overdubbing, only a few lines that I thought I had blown, which were redone one afternoon at the end of the sessions. These were on TVI for sure, and maybe parts of Loose and possibly Dirt. The key features of these arrangements was to avoid the mindless overdubbing that was popular at the time in commercial shit. So there was no doubling of parts when they called double tracking, no wall of sound, which was Phil Spector's signature technique. Pete, can you actually speak? What exactly is the wall of sound via Phil Spector?
That's just he piled tracks upon tracks upon tracks, and back when he was making those records, I think everything was in mono, and the best tape machine you could get had 4 tracks. So it just compressed all the sound, and all you hear is this.
Sorry, go ahead.
Not my favorite way to make a record. And,
interesting.
Yeah. And it's like I remember in the 80s, like when we had 24 tracks eventually on November Coming Fire, and it was like Glenn used them all up.
For what?
Just bullshit.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, that's another record, I guess, that should be unpacked.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that one. I'm down to do that one too. That would be great.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of people's favorite record.
What, November Coming Fire?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think Initium is my favorite, but I love November Coming Fire. There's one song in November. Can you guess what the one song in November Coming Fire for me that I generally skip? What do you think it would be?
Human Pony Girl.
It's Human Pony Girl. That's right. And it's not that I don't think it's an interesting track. It's just, I don't know. It's at the end of the album. You know, I've already like gotten my yayas out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I'm like, Human Pony Girl. I've heard it before. And so I always end up skipping it. I'm not saying it's a bad track. It is. Overall, it's a great album. Of course, it's a great album. All of the Sam Hain albums are great albums. EPs, albums, whatever. But yes, we should definitely, I would love that. We'll talk more about that in a future time. Let me finish powering through this, and then we're going to talk track by track. There was no doubling the parts, no wall of sound, blah, 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 but instead a snaking witchery of a sound. Ron was overdubbing a single string counterpart to himself on Loose. On Down on the Street, there are 2 lead guitars, which add more action to the space. Dirt has a single overdub guitar on the chorus through a Leslie speaker to complement the wah-wah guitar on the basic track. The number where we really went to town with studio possibilities is LA Blues. Live, we used to just call this number the Freak Out. And when we played on the basic track, it was a very true rendition, but it didn't sound insane enough. So we freaked out again while listening to what we had just freaked. It was pretty amazing. So I did not know that. So I guess they freaked out on top of the freak out.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Studio, apparently Scott was not into it.
Really?
Yeah. And he was not, you just kind of like, but you couldn't tell that guy anything.
Yeah, I would imagine rock action is rock action, immovable like a stone, and there's nothing you're gonna tell him or not tell him. So that makes sense. So they had to freak out again while listening to what we had just freaked. It was pretty amazing that everybody was so closely invested in what they had been playing on the basic take. They were able to follow it smoothly and ferociously, again, without the benefit of riff chord, notation, or any signpost. Something about this record that I like is the way that it begins with a couple of very short, fully structured numbers and then slips further and further out of control. That's so true. And away from song structure and sing-along shit as it progresses. Yet it never loses a structure of its own, and each number has a dignified ending, peaceful in a way. This is not meat and potatoes recording. It's not 10 really good songs that the consumer can depend on. If you want your meat and potatoes and 10 really good songs, I suggest you stuff them up your cheesy ass. There's a lot of zeitgeist in this record. The darkness of New York City in the end of the 60s had followed the group to LA, and we found ourselves booked in the amazing Tropicana Motel for these sessions right on the Santa Monica Boulevard, 2 blocks from the studio. We all stayed in shabby suites, grouped around a tight kidney-shaped pool. Our neighbors there were Andy Warhol, Paul Morrissey, Joe, I don't know that guy's name, Joe Dale.
Keep reading. I'll be right back.
Sure, go ahead. Joe Dale Sandro. D'Alessandro. Thank you, Pete. And the beautiful Jane Forth. They were making the Warhol film Heat. Danny Fields was there with us, of course, the great Danny Fields. I was camped next door for Ed Sanders, the writer and leader of the Village Thugs, who was writing his book on Charles Manson and looking for Satan under every coffee table. I took a walk around the boulevard one day and saw a really cool red dog collar in a pet store called the Bowser Boutique. So I bought it for myself. Ed scowled at me and said, you don't know what that means, do you? Andy used to like to watch me swim underwater laps in the pool. And he asked me one day, for your next record, why don't you just play the newspaper, word for word? I woke up in the morning choking from LA smog, which got me really bad because I still had asthma from my childhood. So I would sit in the motel steps, smoking reefer and drinking takeout coffee and having a coughing fit until I could breathe. The reefer helped me to do that. The others would get up around 12, but had to be prodded. Then we'd all walk down to the studio, Abbey Road style, with guitars. We were usually done by 6 p.m. There was a liquor store in the corner where Ron and Dave would go for the booze that they liked to drink while they watched all-night movies on the TV. Once Ron saw Mark Lindsay, the singer from Paul Revere and the Raiders, there. He was pretty excited. I almost ran over one day by John Wayne in a black Caddy convertible DeVille while I was jaywalking across Westmount. He cursed me. I thought, cool. One day I walked up to the hill, to the Sunset Strip to get a tuna sandwich at Ben Frank's. Frank Zappa was sitting right there at the counter, just looking like Frank Zappa. The whole area of Hollywood and the hills was like a sketch that had just begun. There were large empty spaces and plenty of room for parking, most of it on gravel or dirt, but also a lot of green and beautiful light. Eve Babbitts and Christine from the GTOs used to visit me during those sessions. They'd bring me presents and flirt a little. Eve took me to a house in the hills where I heard Bitches Brew by Miles Davis and thought, shit, we're barking up the same tree. How true that is. Christine had a car and she looked and she took me to the Driveway movie to see Superfly. When you're 23 and you've never been anywhere, those were compelling things to do. Finding the ocean, getting gifts from your fans, and making some fucking art. So we did. Iggy fucking Pop. All right. Now we've heard from Iggy. Let's hear more from Pete. Pete, what was it like to learn these songs for Iggy?